The Torah tells us, Kavar tikbarenu bayom ahu, that we have a mitzvah of kfura. We have a mitzvah of burial we are all familiar with. And we'll get into why cremation is prohibited in Jewish law. But first let's understand more the mitzvah of burial. So interesting, the source of burial is not someone who dies, which usually happens. It is someone who is put to death by misas beistin, someone who is killed by beistin. That is what the verse is talking about in Parshas Kisei. So that's clearly a biblical mitzvah to put someone who is put to death by beistin to bury them. Minayin, how do I know that there's a mitzvah of burial for everybody else? We know Abraham buried Sarah, but that's not why it's not binding on us because Abraham did it. Maybe that was just the minhag olam. During that day, people used to bury. Today, people don't bury. How do we know that one is obligated to bury someone if they die a natural death or aren't killed by beistin? So there's a Meshach Chachma. Others point out, and we'll get into the Gemara in Sanhedrin in a minute, that kavar tikbarenu, it's a double language. You shall surely bury. What does it mean, kavar tikbarenu? So the Meshach Chachma interprets the pasuk to mean that when a person is put to death by beistin, so we have a principle in Chazal, in the Gemara, ein kovrin tzaddik eitzel rasha. A righteous person cannot be buried next to a wicked person. And even within wicked people, there's rishis kal, rishis chamar, and the Gemara makes a distinction between a Jewish cemetery, a Jew and a guy. So the source of kavar tikbarenu, the Torah is that you bury them. And what happens? Do you leave them in that cemetery forever? So no. So once the person's body decomposes, as the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin, when your body decomposes, that's when the kapara, the atonement, comes. So then you can move him back into kever avos. You can move him back to an ordinary cemetery, or the cemetery where his parents are, or his family is. So the Meshach Chachma points out, we see from here, that the second tikbarenu, when we inter him from the cemetery of misas beistin, he's like an ordinary person now. His body decomposed and the atonement has begun. And therefore, that's our source. Kavar tikbarenu bayomahu. So it's actually 2 days in the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara in Sanhedrin quotes the Gemara and seems to say the same thing except 2 different words it uses. I think it says minayin l'kfura. How do we know the source of kfura? And another place it says remez l'kfura. So the Lecha Mishnah points out what's the nafka mina between these 2 languages. If it's minayin, so that means where's the source min haTorah that burial is biblical. Remez is generally, there are exceptions, but the general rule is like the exception, I think the Ramban points out in the beginning of Makis, remez edim zomimim. So clearly the concept of edim zomimim, some form of false witnesses, that's a biblical concept. And therefore we see sometimes remez is used in the Rabbi. I think other times minayin, lebirkas haTorah, min haTorah, and others say it's only D'Rabbanan until you find exceptions to the rule. But in general, I think it says the Lasha Minayin, or it says similar language, where the Lecha Mishnah points out that it's Min HaTorah, and if you hold Remez Min HaKfura, Remez is Midrabanan. So it's a Machokas in the Gemara, according to the Lecha Mishnah, whether Kfura is Daraisa Drabanan. Then, so the Gemara goes on and wants to know what is the purpose of Kfura. Who is it for? Who does it benefit? Is it benefiting the dead, or is it benefiting the living? Is it kavod achai or kavod ameis? Of course, there's an element of both. But what is the ikar? What is the primary? Is it kavod ameis or kavod achai? So that's what the Gemara discusses, and the Gemara says, "My nafkamina." Who cares? What's the difference? Either way, you have to do kfura. The Gemara goes into who has to pay for the kfura. If it's kavod ameis, so it comes out of the Yerusha. If it's kavod achai, if you want it, you got to pay for it. And another nafkamina, very prevalent today, is if someone says, I wouldn't say very prevalent, but it's not uncommon today, where a person says, I don't want to be buried. I mean, no one really says they don't want to be buried, but they leave in their will they want to be cremated or something like that. So, do you listen to them? So, if it's kavod achai, so it's nothing to do with them. If it's kavod ameis, then in theory they have the right. So the Rambam paskins, he writes that if someone says they don't want to be buried, we don't listen to them. So he seems to ignore the whole Gemara about kavod achai, kavod ameis. The Lecha Mishnah points out, that's being darshinan taimid dekra. There's a general machlokas in the Gemara, Rav Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, whether we're darshinan taimid dekra, whether we take a reason for a mitzvah and limit or expand the scope of the mitzvah. So Rabbi Yehuda says no, and Rabbi Shimon says yes. So the Lecha Mishnah is the whole discussion. If your whole kfur is deraisa, so then darshinan taimid dekra. That's it. That's what the Rambam paskins. Kfur is deraisa, you have to do it, end of discussion. But according to Lecha Mishnah, it's the whole discussion in the Gemara. Kavod achai, kavod ameis, nafkamina. If they don't want to be buried, that's only according to, if you hold kfur is only drabanan. So we pass and it's deraisa, so therefore it's nothing to discuss. I mean, it is something to discuss, but the answers are given that the halacha is that if someone says not to be buried, we do not listen to them. And in fact, as I said, it's not so uncommon now. Either people who don't know, they never let their kids make that decision or whatever, and it's hard. You have to try to explain to the people why in Judaism, a lot of them don't even know that Judaism is against cremation. You have to try to explain to them why and try to get them not to do it. In fact, al-pi halacha there's a reason, and al-pi machshava there's a reason. Al-pi halacha, Rav Chaim Ozer Grzinski writes that one who does cremation, you're mavatel the mitzvahs of kfura. That if you do cremation, so then you do not fulfill your mitzvah of burial. Even if you take the ashes and put them in the ground, the panim chadashas, they're not even you anymore. I think it's a discussion whether a Kohen could go into a place where it's ashes because it's no longer the dead body anymore. So therefore, even if you take the ashes and bury them, it's not the mitzvah of kfura. Of course, someone who was killed in the Holocaust, in Auschwitz, so if al kavod ameis, you take the ashes and you bury them, and that's really not midinei kfura, that's midin al kavod ameis. So strictly speaking, that's not you anymore. So they point out. So I'm not just thinking aloud now. I'm not paskening this shaila, but there's a major problem today with intermarriage, and therefore there are many spouses. One spouse is Jewish, one is not Jewish, and they want to be buried together. So clearly, that's a problem. The Gemara we said you can't bury Ein Koven Tzaddik to Russia. You can't bury a guy next to a Jew, and so therefore they have different eitzes. You have to be a certain distance away. So maybe if you put them in the back, the Jewish person in the back, and then the non-Jew on the other side behind the fence. So I'm just throwing this out there. I'm just thinking aloud. Maybe another eitzah is if a guy is not chayav in kfura, only a Jew is chayav in kfura. and as Rav Chaim Volozhin explains, because it's based on the halacha of Tashmishe Kedusha Nikvarim Tashmishe Mitzvah Nizrakim, that if you have a mantle of a Sefer Torah and it becomes no good, you can't throw it out, you have to bury it. But Tashmishe Mitzvah, you finish with the lulav and esrog, you finish with the shofar, so then in theory one can throw it out, you should do it derech kava, but there's no halacha, it becomes no good anymore in Nizrakim. So non-Jews have 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, we have 613, but that's not the distinction. It's that we have Torah. That's why the Malach, we have a tradition, the Malach teaches all of us Torah even in the womb, so therefore we're guaranteed that every Jew has Kedusha, and therefore when the Jew dies, it's Tashmisha Kedusha. There's a Ramban who points out that in Eretz Yisrael there's a separate halacha of not to leave over a body, but it's not a din, but the din of Kfura only applies to a Yid and not to a guy. That's why it's a major discussion among some of the poskim about having a medical school in Eretz Yisrael, because normally we rely on the fact that it's non-Jewish bodies, but even that in Eretz Yisrael is a problem leaving bodies over, so apparently obviously the heterim as well, because we have them, but there are those who say it's problematic based on this Ramban. So either way, getting back, so therefore, in theory, if you did the same, a guy's not chayav in kfura, so presumably they could do cremation. If you do cremation, it's no longer he's no longer the guy anymore, and therefore there's more room to work with in terms of some type of burial eitzah. But either way, speak to the question for the Gedolei Yisrael, to decide, what's the appropriate measure. So either way, so they point out that, so that's a halachic reason. Another reason, given more Pi Makshava, and it's a question whether the reason actually is so much Nogea today, because historically speaking, when cremation started, basically it was people who didn't believe, it was the denial of Olam Haba, the denial of the next world, yes, which Judaism believes in. And even though there's no mention of it explicitly in the Torah Shebeksav, it's intentional, because the Torah doesn't want you to put too much, doesn't want you to overemphasize the next world and negate this world, like other religions where people are just looking to get into the next world, and they'll become suicide bombers, murderers, whatever, and they'll go, why not go straight to heaven if that's the purpose? In Judaism it is the goal, but whether you're going to be sitting in the nosebleeds in the upper decks or in the box seats depends on what you do here. So it was a theological thing that a person was in denial of the next world. But now that we have, so now today it's much more pragmatic, and people don't even think about it. So again, it's still prohibited, but I don't know, if anymore if it's denial of the next world. Therefore, it used to be if you were cremated, there was not to sit shiva. So that's a discussion among the contemporary poskim today, whether that's still nogea, especially maybe someone who said they want, certainly someone they has to be cremated and the kids cremated them anyway. But even in a case where somebody has to be cremated, if the person had no idea cremation was against Judaism, etc., so there's what to discuss. The poskim discussed the question, whether today you should have shiva even if a person is cremated. So either way, cremation doesn't work. It's mavatal the mitzvah of kfura, or Pi Makshava was at one point at least, whether it still is, a denial of the next one. That's why, because the Torah tells us you go from Afa to Afa, you come from earth and you go back to earth. And that's why it's not enough this to be put into a coffin. Bakfur means bakarka, it has to be in the ground. And in fact, really strictly speaking, you should be going directly in the ground. We don't need a coffin. In fact, I'm often asked, which coffin should I get? Should I get the $10,000 coffin, the $20,000 one, the $1,000 one? And I always explain first, really it shouldn't be any coffin. Really, as they do in Eretz Yisrael, you go directly in the ground in a kittel, because the quicker the body decomposes, the quicker the atonement. So therefore we want you to be in the ground. We want you to decompose it. It's only North America rules where you have to be buried in a coffin. So what we do is we make holes on the bottom of the coffin. We take earth from Eretz Yisrael, and some Chevra Kadishas, they drop the bottom, and therefore really you are drop the bottom off in the bottom of the coffin. But even though it's against the law of the land, some do it. And because we pass can anyway make a thing like the Ramban, that you can do, it is considered kfura b'karka if you put the coffin on the ground. Like obviously if you just put someone in a coffin and leave them on top, that's the issue of mausoleums and that. Back in the day, it could be above ground if it's inside, like it used to be inside the mountains, inside the ground. But the mausoleums are a problem. Ramosha talks about it. Ramosha is so strict, he says, if you have a mausoleum, then you can't even be buried in the regular cemetery. In fact, it was the mausoleums might have some purpose. There was a case many years ago, it could happen any time, there was a big freeze in North America, and they couldn't do the burial because it was so cold, the caterpillar trucks couldn't even get down. So the question was what to do with the body. So the case was that someone said maybe put them in the mausoleum temporarily, so at least they're not out, and then you'll do the burial when you can. And others said you should get earth, but there's someone said, well, you can't get earth because it's too cold. So they said, no, go to Home Depot or some other store and you can get earth. So either way, different aids is what to do on a temporary basis if you should put them in there. So they point out that really it should be kfura b'karka, and we pass in as long as it's in the ground, that's considered karka. In fact, our minhag today is to use a wooden coffin because wood it decomposes, and it's even though back the Yerushalmi discusses the issue of metal coffins, and they used them. I think Maker Adin we pass you can use a metal coffin. The custom today is to only use wooden. But the Yerushalmi over there is talking about when in a case we don't usually inter bodies, we don't take bodies out and move them because there are issues of shiva. Like if you take the body out and the body's still there, you might be chayiv in another shiva. So the Gemara, so you think Yerushalmi makes a distinction how you take the body. If it's in a wooden coffin, that's like you do a karka, and therefore you'd have to do a new shiva, assuming the body was still intact. But if it's in meadow is a din of karka, and therefore you wouldn't have this whole discussion with the minhag olam is not to use meadow, and we use wooden coffins, and in Eretz Yisrael we do kfura b'karka, but in America we put the earth, or we make the holes on the bottom to fulfill from earth to earth. So these are some of the inyanim regarding kfura. About we paskin kfura is daraisa, and you can't be mochel, and we're against cremation, and you have to put a chatchil in Eretz Yisrael, put the body directly in the ground. But in North America, we also paskin it's okay, and you could put. It's not going against the halacha, so therefore you could listen to Dina Malchus Dina, and you put earth in the coffin from Eretz Yisrael, or you make the holes in the ground, and that's how we fulfill our mitzvah of kura today.